I think that the ideas that Thich Nhat Hanh brings forth in Living Buddha, Living Christ, ideas about service and humility, actually help us to be shaped in that kind of way, to be more of an instrument of love and peace, to be more of our divine nature, more of our God self in all aspects of our lives, wherever we show up, whatever work we do, whatever relationships we have. And so to have models and examples and teachings about how to live that way, I think is important for all of us. And there's a time when we hear ideas for the very first time, a thought, a practice, an idea that we never entertained before. And that's like those wonderful aha moments. And then there are those times that we are reminded of something that we had learned long ago, but maybe we had kind of not paid close attention to in the here and now. I've titled this talk, Living in Service, Walking in Humility. Living in service and walking in humility. And as I was thinking about those words, I was thinking that they are both an attitude. It's an attitude of living in service, an attitude of walking in humility, and they are also actions, things that we do because we have this attitude of living in service and walking in humility. Both Jesus and the Buddha taught and modeled ideas of service and humility. The Buddha taught that true greatness lies in serving others selflessly and in showing kindness and compassion toward all beings. Very simple words, right? Not a complex theology, and yet something that I think, if we're honest with ourselves, we can all look at how we show up in our lives, and there are times that we are maybe not embodying these ideas, not living in service as much as we could be, or as much as the moment or the situation is calling forth and expecting of us, or moments in which we are not being as compassionate as we could be, or as the situation calls forth. Jesus modeled attitudes and ways of being and service, and we're going to get into some of those in a bit here. But this idea of moving through our lives with an energy of service toward the greater good, service toward one another, service in action, and a way of moving in the world with an open heart, a humble heart, a teachable heart, to do what a situation requires and to be willing to do more if we possibly can. As I was going back over my notes yesterday and reading them to myself again and thinking about, well, what does this mean to me and what inspires me to live in greater awareness of service and humility, I was reminded of a book that is actually one of my favorites, and I can tell they're my favorites when they're falling apart and when I have just, paper clips and writing in the margins and all different colors and asterisks at certain sections of the book. Do any of you have books like this where you've done that? And have you ever gone back to them and looked at what you had highlighted before and said, oh, wow, well, that's because I was at that point in my life for dealing with this particular problem or this particular goal? Well, the same is true for me. And this book, The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe by Glenn Clark, is one of those books. I did a series on it, I think, many, many years ago. But as I was working on this lesson again on humility and service, I was reminded of a story in this book. The book is a book about Walter Russell. And if you don't know who that was, look him up, look up a copy of this book. But he exemplified at a very early age, this idea of service, of just giving what you can as you can, because you can, without an ulterior motive. And that how in that way of being, eventually so much comes back to bless your life. And so The story that I was remembering was the story of Walter Russell when he was a young boy. He was about 15 years old, and he had taken a summer job working as a bellboy in a very famous hotel. I don't remember what hotel it was, but he was going to work as a bellboy in this hotel for the summer, and he was told that the salary was $8 a month. So you know this is a really old story. Really old story, but the principles are the same principles, whether it's an old story or a contemporary story. So anyway, he took this job as a bellboy, knowing that he was only going to be paid $8 a month, but he was told that the tips at the end of the summer could amount to about $100, and that was a lot of money to him, and a lot of money back then. And so whatever he did as his first act as a bellboy, when he completed that act, the guest wanted to give him a tip. And there was something inside of him. Now he's 15 years old. Something inside of him that said, don't take the tip. And so he refused it. He said, no, thank you. I like my job. No, thank you. I'm not going to take the tip. And then later that night, he was trying to understand himself. Have you ever done that? You know, you've had a certain action and then you go back, well, what was that about? Why did I feel compelled to act in that way? So even at 15, he asked himself what that was about. And the answer he got was that he was to be the best bellboy that the world had ever known, and the only one that was never going to take a tip and was just going to do his job with tremendous joy and compassion just because. That's a pretty powerful thing for a 15-year-old boy. And so he operated that way the entire summer. And there's specific examples in the book of what he did, like getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get a special kind of milk for a guest who had a baby who was ill and needed this special kind of milk. And then he'd go back to sleep to get a few more hours of sleep, wouldn't take a tip for it. He would go out of his way to do whatever was needed to do because he was compelled from within to act in such a way of service and humility. And so what started to happen, he kept refusing all these tips, and all of these guests started inviting him to special dinners at the hotel, to the special parties. And what do you think the management said? You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to fraternize with the powerful, wealthy guests here. And those guests said, if you do not let him come to our parties, if you do not let him sit and be with us as our dinner guest, we will never come back again. Management changed their tune. Management changed their attitude. And the result of what happened at the end of this summer, at the end of the summer, during the summer, he had been sketching and painting, and some of the guests started to see his sketchings and paintings and liked them and started to want to buy them. And at the end of the season, instead of $100 in tips, he received $850 for the paintings and pictures he had done. He received 5 offers of legal adoption in those wealthy families. It says at the end, he was invited to the wedding of the baby that he got that special milk for at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's just this beautiful story of humility and service, We have examples of humility and service in the life of Jesus, in the life of the Buddha. We have examples of humility and service, and I'll share a few in just a few minutes, of other people that we look up to and that we hold as models of how we might want to be and do better in the world. Jesus was considered to be a model of humility and service. We have the story of him, at least the reported story of him, washing his disciples' feet. Holy Week, washing his disciples' feet. I don't know about you, but when was the last time you washed somebody's feet? Right? Maybe not unless you have an elderly parent or a nurse. You probably aren't washing somebody's feet. And imagine the feet of the people that of the disciples that he was washing? Do you think they had nice socks and closed-toed shoes? No. Do you think that they, took baths frequently? Probably not. So their feet were probably pretty dirty. And whether that story is absolutely literally true or not, the idea of it being included in the Gospels to me suggests that there was this way of being that Jesus had of service and humility, not above anyone. And what's so funny and sad to me is the church has put him in the minds of so many people so far above them that we forget that he said things like, the things that I do, you will do also. He was an example of humility, of the people that he associated with, the very ones that the scribes and the Pharisees wanted nothing to do with, but those were the folks he hung out with. Is that not an example of humility? It is to me, of this idea that I can learn from anyone and everything. I can learn from everyone and everything. I think that the moment that we stop believing that to be true is the moment that we really stop learning. And when we stop learning, I think we stop growing. There is not a person in your life, there's not a person in my life that I can't learn something from. It might be how I don't want to act. It might be a way of being I don't want to model. We have all different kinds of teachers in our life. Have you noticed that? Teachers that we absolutely love and adore, and teachers that fall under the label I give them, sandpaper to my soul teachers. They are still my teachers. They are still my teachers. Jesus talked about, if you do it to the least of these, you have done it to me. I can't think of a greater expression or demonstration of humility and service than that. If you do it to the least of these, you have done it to me. Feed them, clothe them, serve them. I have to be careful here how I say this, because to me this is not political. To me this is spiritual, and it's spiritual. I don't know how the religious right is acting the way they act and forgetting such a fundamental teaching of Jesus that we are to serve one another. That if we really are followers of this person, this teacher, then we would be about serving the least of these, because we would believe, we would feel as if we were serving that teacher of ours. This to me is where spirituality and the world intersect. To me, that's not politics. To me, that is, we need to care about each other. And that means showing up in those tough places, being willing to make a difference, being willing to act with compassion, being not afraid of the one that looks different than us. Am I just talking to myself again this morning? Maybe I'm just talking to myself again this morning. We have Jesus talking about the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We want to talk about a mystical oxymoron, right? The first shall be last and the last shall be first. That is an expression of humility. That is an expression of humility. It is the awareness that there is not a single person on the planet from which I cannot learn. There's not a single person on the planet from which I cannot grow and to a better version of myself. When you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. The Buddha taught humility and service as well. The Buddha renounced his princely life and lived until he became enlightened as an ascetic. And then he taught the middle way, and I love that. I know enough of Buddhism, but I haven't studied it deeply as some have. But one of the things I appreciate so very much about the Buddhist practice and the Buddhist teaching is this idea of the middle path. The middle path. To walk the middle path, I think, requires humility. To walk the middle path requires service. It's not to renounce ourselves, it's to lift one another up equally. Equally. We all have the divine spark within us, every single one of us. That's core in our New Thought teaching. It's one of our 5 basic principles, that we are born with the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the divine, if you will, every single one of us. And when we live our lives with this energy and this attitude of humility as taught and exemplified by Jesus or the Buddha, then we are living from that place and giving expression to the God in us. God can only do for the world what we allow God to do through us. Think about that for a moment. God, the energy of the one presence and one power, can only do for the world what we allow it to do through us. It means that in humble service, we are the hands and the minds and the heart of this presence of God, whatever we want to call that. And that wherever we are is where and how God is showing up in that moment. It is where and how we can make a difference in a small way or in a big way. Sometimes it's just an encouraging word to another person that can totally transform and lift their life experience. And none of this is beyond the reach of every single one of us. To live in service, to walk in humility. The Buddha emphasized the importance of service as a means of cultivating compassion and spiritual growth. Cultivating compassion and spiritual growth. Encouraging his followers to practice, to walk in those footsteps. There is in Mahayana Buddhism the idea of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is a being who chooses to seek enlightenment in service to others. It's one of the things that I think we are missing in New Thought. Steve, you said this to me once. We were talking about the dynamics of New Thought teachings and how, when not understood as deeply as I think we need to understand them, that in our teachings we almost have this revolving door. The revolving door meaning that many people come into New Thought because they're looking for something. Nothing wrong with that. That's how I got in as well. Coming in looking for something, an answer to a problem or some sort of healing in their lives or some sort of blessing in their lives. And when they get that, when they get the teachings and they get the blessing and get fixed whatever they felt needed to be fixed or healed, then they leave. And my understanding of Buddhism and the Sangha is, yes, you grow and you evolve, and if there's healing that needs to happen within yourself, you take the teachings to help that happen, but you don't leave. When there is that awakening for yourself, when there is that healing or that growth for yourself, you stay, not necessarily because you're going to hear something new that you never heard before. You stay to help the others that aren't quite there. That's very different, isn't it? That's very different. And I humbly think that that is a missing piece for us in New Thought. And I think that maybe it's the reason that our teaching isn't expanding in its influence and reach the way that it could, and the way that I think it needs to help heal our world. It's not just about us getting ourselves whole and complete and fixed and whatever it is we think is wrong with us that we're trying to use these teachings to help us heal from. We do that and we stick around to heal our world with love. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? That's what I think the community energy is about. And it's what sustains us, I think, to do this deeper work that I believe is really, really needed right now. So living in service and living in humility is a very deep and potentially very rich way of living our lives. It's to recognize in the truest sense our God-given abilities and talents to make a positive difference, and then to be earnest in how we go about doing that. In my notes, I had listed a number of people that I hold up in my mind as beautiful examples of living in service and walking in humility. Examples like Mother Teresa lived such a very simple life. I can't remember where it was. I think it was I was invited to a speech she gave at one of the universities many, many years ago. And one of the things I was struck by was just how tiny this person was, and yet the enormity of her influence for good. And whether you agree with everything that she said or her Catholic theology or not, I don't think you can discount the power of her influence to walk humbly, to live in service, and to make a deep and positive change. I think of her, and I think of how could I be even just a tiny bit more like that. I think of Mahatma Gandhi. I think of his commitment to freeing India from British control and doing it peacefully and nonviolently, and not just only peacefully and nonviolently, but committed to the idea that when the British leave, they should leave as friends. Do you think that's a tall order? That's like an incredibly high bar to set. But when there are those who have gone before us that set high bars, I hope that they live in your mind and heart kind of in the way they do in mine, not to feel that you have to be them or do as much because maybe you just can't, but to know that there are those who have, and by virtue of the fact that they have, then you and I can do a little bit more. Does that make sense? A little bit more. There are so many others, and I'm looking at the time. I don't want to be too late here. In this topic of humility and service, I thought, well, is there any place that this is being talked about in the business world right now? And so I did a little bit of looking last night, and I came across an article in the Economic Times. It was written in October of last year, and the title of the article is "The Role of Humility in Effective Leadership." The role of humility in effective leadership, lessons from top executives. I'm just going to read to you the synopsis of the article. You can search it out on your own if you want to read the full article, but the synopsis is this. Humility is a crucial yet often overlooked trait in leadership. It builds trust and credibility, encourages openness to feedback and learning, empowers others, improves decision-making, resolves conflicts, and promotes a culture of admitting mistakes. Humble leaders practice servant leadership, inspire and motivate their teams, create learning cultures, and prioritize long-term success. Examples of leaders who embody humility include Warren Buffett, Nelson Mandela, and Mary Barra. Humility is not a sign of weakness, but a hallmark of exceptional leaders. I like that last statement. Not a sign of weakness, but a hallmark of exceptional leaders. I wrote down, and I'll share it quickly here, what humility in action might look like. Humility in action, I think, looks like graciousness and success. Graciousness and success. Humility in action looks like acknowledging mistakes, privately and publicly, whatever is the right context for that. Humility in action looks like valuing and remembering the contributions of others, the truth of the matter is none of us are self-made. All of us stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us that have made open doors for us, some of whom we have known to open the doors and others that maybe we never even knew made our way a little bit easier. Humility in action, to me, looks like listening attentively and deeply. I remember that each of the 3 multi-day long synthesis dialogues I was part of years ago with the Dalai Lama. And what I can say to you, both from the receiving end and from the observing end, I never saw him listen any differently to who was speaking to him based on whether they were famous or powerful or young or old or had all sorts of titles and credentials. No matter who I saw him speaking to, and in fact, when I had a chance to speak to him, felt as if he treated everyone with the same humility, we are the same. I can learn from you and you can learn from me. The way we show up like that, I think really, really matters. I would invite you to actually make your own list, both in terms of humility and in terms of service. When we think of service, it's really about showing up and doing what we can where there is a need, finding a hurt and filling it, finding a need and filling it, if we can, but being mindful about that. And so I would suggest that our homework is to acknowledge what we already know and what we're already doing well and right, and then to maybe go a little bit further and say, what else could I do? How else or where else could I show up at work or at home or at school or in business with greater humility and with a greater attitude of being in service to the other? I leave you with that. Namaste.